The Little Mermaid by H.C. Andersen. Far out in the ocean, the water is as blue as the petals of the most beautiful cornflower and as clear as the purest glass, but it is very deep, deeper than any anchor rope can reach. Many church steeples would have to be stacked on top of each other to reach from the bottom up to the surface of the water. Down there, the sea folk live. Now one must not think that there is only a bare, white sandy bottom. No, the most wondrous trees and plants grow down there, so flexible in stem and leaf that they move with the slightest motion of the water, as if they were alive. All the fish, big and small, dart among the branches, just like the birds up here in the air. At the very deepest spot lies the Sea King's castle, its walls built of coral and its long, pointed windows made of the clearest amber. The roof is made of mussel shells that open and close as the water flows. It looks delightful, for in each shell there is a sparkling pearl, any one of which would be a splendid adornment in a queen's crown. The Sea King down there had been a widower for many years, but his old mother took care of his household. She was a wise woman, but proud of her royal lineage, and that is why she wore 12 oysters on her tail, whereas the other nobles could only wear 6. Otherwise, she was much praised, especially because she loved the little sea princesses, her granddaughters. They were 6 lovely children, but the youngest was the most beautiful of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose petal, and her eyes were as blue as the deepest sea. But like all the others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a fish tail. All through the long day, they could play in the castle's large halls where living flowers grew out of the walls. The grand amber windows would be opened, and then the fish would swim into them, just as the swallows fly into our rooms when we open the windows. But the fish would swim straight to the little princesses, eat from their hands, and let themselves be patted. Outside the castle, there was a large garden with trees of fiery red and dark blue. The fruits shone like gold, and the flowers like burning flames as they constantly moved their stems and leaves. The ground itself was the finest sand, but it was blue like sulphur flame. Above everything down there lay a wondrous blue shimmer. One would almost think that they were standing high up in the air, only seeing sky above and below, rather than being at the bottom of the sea. In utter stillness, one could glimpse the sun, appearing like a purple flower, from whose chalice all the light streamed forth. Each of the little princesses had her small spot in the garden where she could dig and plant as she pleased. One gave her flower bed the shape of a whale, another preferred hers to resemble a little mermaid. But the youngest made hers perfectly round like the sun and only had flowers that shone as red as it. She was a peculiar child, quiet and contemplative. While her other sisters adorned their spots with the most wondrous things they had found from stranded ships, she only wanted, besides the sun like rosy flowers, a beautiful marble statue. It was a delightful boy, carved out of white, clear stone and had washed ashore after a shipwreck. Next to the statue, she planted a rosy red weeping willow, which grew beautifully and hung its fresh branches over it, towards the blue sandy bottom, where the shadow appeared violet and was in motion, just like the branches. It looked as if the top and roots were playfully kissing each other. No joy was greater for her than hearing about the world above the water. The old grandmother had to tell her everything she knew about ships and cities, people and animals. She found it wonderfully delightful that above on the earth, the flowers had fragrance, something they didn't have at the bottom of the sea, and that the forests were green. The fish seen among the branches could sing so loudly and beautifully that it was a pleasure to hear. They were the small birds that the grandmother called fish, for otherwise, they wouldn't understand her since they had never seen a bird. "When you turn 15, said the grandmother, you will be allowed to swim up from the sea, sit in the moonlight on the cliffs, and see the large ships sailing by. You will see forests and cities." The next year, one of the sisters turned 15, but the others, well, one was a year younger than the other, so the youngest had to wait for another 5 years before she could come up from the sea bottom and see what it was like up here with us. But the one who turned 15 promised the others to tell them what she had seen and found most delightful on the first day, as their grandmother didn't tell them enough. There was so much they wanted to know. None was as longing as the youngest, the very one who had the longest time to wait and was so quiet and thoughtful. Many nights she stood by the open window, looking up through the dark blue water where the fish flapped their fins and tails. She could see the moon and stars, though they shone quite pale, they appeared much larger through the water than to our eyes. If a dark cloud-like shadow passed beneath them, she knew it was either a whale swimming above her or a ship with many people. They probably never thought that a beautiful little mermaid was below, reaching her white hands up toward their keel. Now the oldest princess was 15 years old and was allowed to rise above the surface of the sea. When she returned, she had 100 things to tell, but the most delightful, she said, was lying in the moonlight on a sandbank in the calm sea and seeing the big city nearby, where the lights sparkled like 100 stars. She could hear music and the noise and bustle of carriages and people, see the many church towers and spires, and hear the bells ringing. Just because she couldn't go up there, she longed for all of this the most. Oh, how the youngest sister listened, and when she stood by the open window in the evening and looked up through the dark blue water, she thought of the grand city with all its noise and bustle, and it seemed to her that she could hear the church bells ringing down to her. The next year, the second sister got permission to rise through the water and swim wherever she wanted. She came up just as the sun was setting, and she found that sight to be the most beautiful. The whole sky looked like gold, she said, and the clouds, their splendor she could not describe enough. They sailed over her in shades of red and violet, but faster than they, a flock of wild swans flew, like a long white veil, across the water where the sun was. She swam towards it, but it sank, and the rosy glow went out on the sea surface, and so did the clouds. The following year, the third sister came up. She was the boldest of them all, so she swam up a broad river that flowed into the sea. She saw delightful green hills with vineyards, castles, and farms peeking out among magnificent forests. She heard the songs of all the birds, and the sun shone so hot that she often had to dive under the water to cool her burning face. In a small cove, she met a whole flock of little human children. They were completely naked, running and splashing in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away in fear, and a little black creature, a dog, came, but she had never seen a dog before, and it barked so frighteningly at her that she became afraid and swam out into the open sea. However, she could never forget the magnificent forests, the green hills, and the lovely children who could swim on the water despite not having a fish tail. The fourth sister wasn't as bold. She found herself in the middle of the wild ocean, and she said that it was just the most wonderful experience. She could see for many miles all around her, and the sky above looked like a giant glass bell. She had seen ships, but from afar, they looked like seagulls. The playful dolphins did somersaults, and the huge whales sprayed water from their blowholes, looking like 100 fountains all around. Now it was the fifth sister's turn. Her birthday was in the winter, and that's why she saw what the others hadn't seen on their first time above the water. The sea looked completely green, and there were large icebergs floating around. Each one looked like a pearl, she said, and yet they were much larger than the church towers humans built. They appeared in the most wondrous shapes and glimmered like diamonds. She had perched herself on one of the largest icebergs, and all the sailors passed by in fear, steering their ships away, as she let the wind fly through her long hair. But as evening fell, the sky became covered with clouds, lightning flashed, and thunder roared, while the Black Sea lifted the massive ice blocks high up and made them shine with the red lightning. All the ships took in their sails. There was fear and dread, but she sat calmly on her floating iceberg, watching the blue lightning strike zigzag into the gleaming sea. The first time any of the sisters rose above the water, they were always delighted by the novelty and beauty they saw. But now, as grown-up girls, they were allowed to go up whenever they pleased, and they became indifferent to it all. They longed for home again, and after a month had passed, they would say that it was still loveliest down below, and it was so nice to be at home there. Many evenings, the 5 sisters linked arms and rose in a row above the water. They had beautiful voices, lovelier than any humans, and when a storm approached and it seemed like ships might sink, they swam in front of the ships and sang so beautifully about how beautiful it was at the bottom of the sea, encouraging the sailors not to be afraid to come down there. But the sailors couldn't understand their words. They thought it was the storm, and they didn't get to see the beauty down there either, because when the ship sank, the people drowned and only arrived at the Sea King's castle as if dead. When the sisters thus rose high above the sea in the evening, arm in arm, the little sister stood all alone and watched them, and it was as if she wanted to cry, but mermaids have no tears, so she suffered even more. "Oh, if only I were 15 years old," she said. "I know I would come to love the world above and the humans who build and live up there." Finally, she turned 15. "Look, now we have you out of our hands," said her grandmother, the old widowed queen. "Come now, let me dress you up like your other sisters." And she placed a wreath of white lilies on her hair, but each flower petal was half a pearl. The old queen had 8 large oysters fastened to the princess's tail to show her high rank. "It hurts," said the little mermaid. "Yes, one must endure something for all this grandeur," said the old one. Oh, she would have loved to shake off all this finery and cast away the heavy crown. Her red flowers in the garden suited her much better. But now she dared not do it. "Farewell," she said, and floated up through the water as lightly and clear as a bubble. The sun had just set as she lifted her head above the sea, but all the clouds still shone like roses and gold, and in the midst of the pale red air, the evening star sparkled so clearly and beautifully. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea was calm as a mirror. A large ship with 3 masts lay there. Only one sail was up, for not a breeze stirred the rigging, and on the masts, sailors sat. There was music and singing, and as the evening grew darker, 100 colorful lights were lit. They looked as if all the flags of every nation were waving in the air. The little mermaid swam right up to the cabin window, and each time the water lifted her, she could see through the clear panes where so many finely dressed people stood. But the most beautiful of all was the young prince with the big black eyes. He couldn't have been more than 16 years old. It was his birthday, and that's why all this splendor was happening. Sailors were dancing on the deck, and when the young prince came out, over 100 rockets shot up into the sky. They shone like the bright day, and the little mermaid got so startled that she dived back under the water. But soon, she resurfaced, and then it seemed as if all the stars in the sky were falling down to her. She had never seen such fireworks before. Large suns spun around, magnificent firefish swirled through the blue air, and everything shone brightly in the clear, still sea. The ship itself was so brightly lit that every little rope could be seen, as well as the people on board. Oh, how handsome the young prince was! He shook hands with the people, laughed, and smiled while the music played in the lovely night. It got late, but the little mermaid couldn't take her eyes off the ship and the handsome prince. The colorful lights were extinguished, and the fireworks no longer shot up into the sky. There were no more cannon shots, but deep down in the sea, there was a rumbling and roaring. She sat on the water, rocking up and down so that she could see into the cabin. But the ship gained speed, one sail spread after the other. The waves became stronger, and big clouds gathered. There was lightning far away. Oh, there would be a dreadful storm. So the sailors took in the sails. The large ship rocked at flying speed on the wild sea. The water rose like large black mountains, about to fall over the mast. But the ship dipped like a swan between the high waves, only to lift up again on the towering waters. The little mermaid thought it was a fun ride, but the sailors didn't. The ship creaked and groaned, the thick planks strained against the strong impacts. The sea surged against the ship, and the mast snapped in the middle as if it were a reed. The ship listed on its side while water poured into the hold. Now the little mermaid saw that they were in danger. She had to watch out for beams and pieces of the ship that floated on the water. One moment, it was pitch dark, and she couldn't see anything, but when it lightened, it became clear again, and she recognized everyone on the ship. Each person was struggling as best as they could. She particularly searched for the young prince, and she saw him sinking into the deep sea as the ship split apart. At first, she was delighted because now he would come down to her. But then she remembered that humans couldn't survive in the water, and he couldn't come down to her father's palace except as a dead man. No, he must not die. Therefore, she swam among beams and planks floating on the sea, completely forgetting that they could have crushed her. She dove deep underwater and then rose high above the waves, finally reaching the young prince, who could hardly swim anymore in the stormy sea. His arms and legs were becoming weak, his beautiful eyes closed, and he had to die if the little mermaid hadn't come. She held his head above water and let the waves carry her with him wherever they wanted. In the morning hours, the bad weather had passed. Not a single piece of the ship was visible. The sun rose so red and shining from the water, as if the prince's cheeks gained life from it. But his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his tall, handsome forehead and brushed his wet hair back. He looked like the marble statue in her little garden. She kissed him again and wished for him to live. Now she saw the solid land in front of her, with tall blue mountains whose peaks glistened with white snow, resembling swans lying there. Down by the coast, there were beautiful green forests, and in front, there was a church or a monastery. She couldn't quite tell, but it was a building. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and tall palm trees stood in front of the gate. The sea formed a small bay that was calm but very deep, right up to the cliffs where the white fine sand had washed up. She swam there with the beautiful prince, laid him in the sand, but took care to raise his head high in the warm sunshine. Now the bells rang in the large white building, and many young girls came through the garden. The little mermaid swam further out behind some tall stones that rose out of the water, put sea foam on her hair and her chest so that no one could see her little face, and then she watched who came to the poor prince. It didn't take long before a young girl arrived. She seemed to be quite frightened, but only for a moment. Then she went to fetch more people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came back to life, and he smiled at everyone around him, but he didn't smile at her. He didn't even know that she had saved him. She felt so sorrowful, and when he was taken into the large building, she sadly dove down into the water and swam back home to her father's palace. Always, she had been quiet and thoughtful, but now she became even more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen the first time up there, but she didn't tell them anything. Many evenings and mornings, she went back to where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits of the garden ripen and get picked, she saw the snow melting on the tall mountains, but she didn't see the prince, and that's why she always returned home even more saddened. Her only solace was to sit in her little garden and embrace the beautiful marble statue that resembled the prince. But she didn't tend to her flowers. They grew like a wilderness, spreading over the paths and intertwining their long stems and leaves with the branches of the trees, creating a gloomy atmosphere. Eventually, she couldn't bear it any longer and confided in one of her sisters, and soon all the others knew about it, and not just them, but a few other mermaids who only shared it with their closest friends. One of them had information about who the prince was. She had also seen the splendor on the ship, knew where he was from, and where his kingdom lay. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses, and with their arms around each other's shoulders, they ascended in a long row up from the sea, right in front of where they knew the prince's castle lay. It was built of a bright yellowish glistening stone, with grand marble staircases. One of them led straight down to the sea. Magnificent gilded domes rose above the roof, and between the pillars that encircled the entire building stood marble statues that looked lifelike. Through the clear glass of the high windows, one could see into the most splendid halls, where precious silk curtains and carpets were hung, and all the walls adorned with large paintings that were a pleasure to behold. In the middle of the grandest hall, there was a large fountain, and the water jets rose high toward the glass dome in the ceiling, through which the sun shone onto the water and the beautiful plants that grew in the large basin. Now she knew where he lived, and she came there many evenings and nights on the water. She swam much closer to the land than any of the others had dared, and she even went up into the narrow canal under the magnificent marble balcony, which cast a long shadow over the water. There she sat and watched the young prince, who believed he was completely alone in the clear moonlight. Many evenings, she saw him sail with music in his magnificent boat, with flags waving in the wind. She peeped out among the green reeds and let the wind catch her long, silvery white veil, and some who saw it thought it was a swan spreading its wings. She heard many nights when the fishermen lay with their lanterns on the sea, talking so fondly about the young prince, and it pleased her that she had saved his life when he was half dead and adrift on the waves. She thought about how his head had rested on her chest and how deeply she had kissed him. He knew nothing about it, he couldn't even dream of her. More and more, she grew fond of humans, and more, she wished she could ascend among them. Their world seemed much larger than hers. They could fly across the seas on ships, climb tall mountains high above the clouds, and their lands, with forests and fields, stretched farther than she could see. There was so much she wanted to know, but her sisters couldn't answer everything, so she asked the old grandmother, who was well acquainted with the higher world, which she rightly called the lands above the sea. "When humans don't drown," the little mermaid asked, "do they always live? Don't they die like we do here in the sea?" "Yes," said the old one, "they must also die, and their lifespans are even shorter than ours. We can live for 300 years, but when we cease to exist here, we become mere foam on the water, without even a grave down here among our loved ones. We have no immortal soul, we never gain life again. We are like the green reeds, once they are cut, they cannot grow back. Humans, on the other hand, have a soul that lives forever, even after their bodies turn to dust. It ascends through the clear air, up to all the shining stars. Just as we emerge from the sea and see the lands of humans, they ascend to unknown, beautiful places that we will never see. Why didn't we get an immortal soul? Said the Little Mermaid sorrowfully. I would give all 300 years I have to live just for one day as a human and then share in the heavenly world. You mustn't think about that, said the Old One. We are much happier and better off than the humans up there. So, I will die and float like foam on the sea, unable to hear the music of the waves, see the beautiful flowers, and the red sun. Is there really nothing I can do to gain an eternal soul? No, said the Old One. Only if a human loved you so much that you meant more to him than his father and mother, when he clung to you with all his thoughts and love, and with the priest's blessing, he laid his right hand in yours, promising fidelity here and for all eternity, then his soul would flow into your body, and you would also share in the happiness of humans. He would give you a soul and still keep his own. But that can never happen. What is delightful here in the sea, your fish tail, they find ugly up on land. They don't understand it any better. They must have two clumsy supports they call legs to be considered beautiful. Then, the Little Mermaid sighed and looked sadly at her fish tail. Let us be content, said the Old One. We will dance and frolic during the 300 years we have to live. It's plenty of time, and afterwards, we can rest peacefully in our graves. Tonight, we shall have a royal ball. It was a spectacle like nothing seen on earth. The walls and ceiling of the grand ballroom were made of thick but clear glass. Rows of several hundred colossal seashells, rose-red and grass-green, lined each side, emitting a blue, burning fire that illuminated the entire hall and shone through the walls, making the sea outside brightly lit. All the countless fish, large and small, swimming towards the glass wall, some had shimmering scales in purple, while others seemed silver and gold. In the middle of the hall flowed a wide running stream, and on it, mermaids and mermen danced to their own delightful song. They had the most beautiful voices, more enchanting than any human on earth. The Little Mermaid sang more beautifully than all of them, and they applauded her, and for a moment, she felt joy in her heart, knowing that she possessed the loveliest voice in both the sea and on land. Yet, she couldn't forget the world above her. She couldn't shake off her sorrow for not having an immortal soul like the beautiful prince did. So, while all the festivities continued inside her father's palace, she sat sorrowfully in her little garden. Then she heard the sound of hunting horns resonating through the water, and she thought, he is sailing up there, the one I love more than father and mother, the one my thoughts are attached to, and in whose hand I would entrust my life's happiness. I will risk everything to win him and gain an immortal soul. While my sisters dance inside my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch, whom I have always feared, but perhaps she can offer some advice and help. The Little Mermaid then ventured towards the roaring whirlpools, behind which the sea witch resided. She had never taken this path before. No flowers or sea grass grew there, only the bare grey sandy bottom extended towards the whirlpools, where the water whirled like millwheels, dragging everything it caught into the depths. She had to walk through these crushing eddies to enter the sea witch's territory, and for a long stretch, there was no other way but across the hot, bubbling mire, which the witch called her turf bog. Her house lay behind it, deep within a strange forest. All the trees and bushes were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed serpents growing out of the ground, and all their branches were long, slimy arms with fingers like supple worms. Joint by joint, they moved from root to the outermost tip. Whatever they could grab in the sea, they twisted their arms around and never let go. The little mermaid stood outside, utterly frightened, her heart pounded with fear, and she almost turned back. But then, she thought of the prince and the human soul, and that gave her courage. She tied her long, flowing hair around her head, so the polyps wouldn't grasp it, and she folded her hands over her chest and flew through, just like a fish gliding through the water, in between the dreadful polyps, stretching their supple arms and fingers after her. She saw that each of them had something they had caught. Hundreds of tiny arms held onto it like strong iron bands. Human beings who had perished at sea and sunk deep down appeared as white, bone-like skeletons in the polyps' arms. They held onto shipwrecked oars and chests. Among them was a little mermaid they had captured and strangled. That was the most terrifying sight for her. Now she arrived at a large, slimy clearing in the forest, where big, fat water snakes wriggled around, displaying their ugly yellow-white bellies. In the middle of the clearing stood a house made of white human bones, washed ashore. There sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as humans let canaries eat sugar. She called those repulsive, fat water snakes her little chicks and let them wriggle on her large, spongy chest. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. "It's a foolish thing to do, but still, I'll grant your wish, my beautiful princess. You want to get rid of your fish tail and have instead 2 stubs to walk on like humans, so that the young prince can fall in love with you, and you can marry him and gain an immortal soul." With that, the witch laughed so loud and dreadfully that the toad and the snakes fell down to the ground and writhed there. "You've come at just the right time," said the witch. "Tomorrow, when the sun rises, I won't be able to help you until another year has passed. I'll prepare a potion for you. When you swim to the shore before sunrise, sit there and drink it. Your tail will divide and shrink into what humans call beautiful legs, but it will hurt like a sharp sword cutting through you. Anyone who sees you will say you are the loveliest human they've ever seen. You'll retain your graceful gait, no dancer can float like you. But every step you take will feel like treading on sharp knives, and your blood will flow. Will you endure all of this for my help?" "Yes," said the little mermaid with a trembling voice, thinking of the prince and gaining an immortal soul. "But remember," said the witch, "once you've acquired a human form, you can never become a mermaid again. You can never descend into the water to see your sisters or your father's palace. And if you fail to win the prince's love so that he forgets his father and mother for you, and remains entirely devoted to you, letting the priest join your hands in marriage, then you won't gain an immortal soul. The morning after he marries someone else, your heart will break, and you will turn into sea foam." "I'll do it," said the little mermaid, her face pale as death. "But you must also pay me," said the witch. "And it's not a small price I demand. You possess the most beautiful voice of all down here on the ocean floor, and with that voice, you believe you can enchant him. But that voice must belong to me. I want the best thing you own for my precious potion. I must give my own blood to make the potion sharp as a 2-edged sword. But when you take my voice," said the little mermaid, "what will I have left?" "Your beautiful appearance," said the witch, "your graceful walk, and your expressive eyes, those can certainly enchant a human heart. Now, have you lost your courage? Stick out your little tongue, and I'll cut it off as payment, and you shall have the powerful potion." "I agree," said the little mermaid, and the witch placed her cauldron on to boil the magic potion. "Cleanliness is a good thing," she said, scrubbing the cauldron with the snakes she tied into a knot. Then she made a cut in her own chest and let her black blood drip into it. The steam formed the most bizarre shapes, causing fear and anxiety. Every moment, the witch added new things to the cauldron, and when it boiled, it looked like when a crocodile cries. Finally, the potion was ready, appearing like the clearest water. "There you have it," said the witch, cutting off the little mermaid's tongue, leaving her mute and unable to sing or speak. "If the polyps try to catch you when you pass through my forest," said the witch, "just throw a single drop of this potion at them, and their arms and fingers will shatter into 1,000 pieces." But the little mermaid didn't need to do that. The polyps withdrew in fear when they saw the shining potion in her hand, looking like a sparkling star. Thus, she quickly made her way through the forest, the moss, and the roaring whirlpools. She saw her father's palace. The lights were out in the grand dance hall, and they must all be asleep inside. But she dared not seek them now, being mute and having to leave them forever. It felt like her heart would break with sorrow. She sneaked into the garden, took one flower from each of her sister's flower beds, blew 1,000 kisses towards the castle, and ascended through the dark blue sea. The sun had not yet risen when she saw the prince's castle and climbed the magnificent marble staircase. The moon shone beautifully bright. The little mermaid drank the burning, sharp potion, and it felt like a two-edged sword went through her delicate body. She fainted and lay there as if dead. When the sun shone over the sea, she woke up, feeling a burning pain, but right in front of her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his dark eyes on her, causing her to lower hers, and she noticed that her fishtail was gone, replaced by the most delicate little white legs any little girl could have. But she was completely naked, so she wrapped herself in her long, flowing hair. The prince asked who she was and how she had come there, and she looked at him with her dark blue eyes, mild and yet so sorrowful, but she couldn't speak. He took her hand and led her into the castle. Every step she took was as the witch had foretold, as if she was treading on pointed needles and sharp knives, but she endured it gladly, holding the prince's hand. She felt light as a bubble, and he and everyone marveled at her charming, graceful walk. She was dressed in exquisite clothes of silk and muslin, becoming the most beautiful of all in the palace, but she was mute, unable to sing or speak. Lovely slave girls dressed in silk and gold came forth and sang for the prince and his royal parents. One song was more beautiful than the others, and the prince applauded and smiled at her, which made the little mermaid sad. She knew she had sung far more beautifully herself. She thought, "Oh, if only he knew that to be with him, I have given away my voice for all eternity." Then the slave girls danced in graceful, floating movements to the most glorious music. The little mermaid raised her beautiful white arms, stood on tiptoes, and glided over the floor, dancing as no one had ever danced before. With each movement, her beauty became more apparent, and her eyes spoke deeper to the heart than the slave girls singing. Everyone was delighted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. She danced more and more, even though each time her foot touched the ground, it felt like she was stepping on sharp knives. The prince said she should always be with him, and she was allowed to sleep on a velvet cushion outside his door. He had a man's costume made for her so that she could ride with him. They rode through fragrant woods, where the green branches brushed her shoulders, and the little birds sang behind the fresh leaves. She climbed with the prince up high mountains, and although her delicate feet bled, visible to others, she still laughed and followed him until they saw the clouds sailing beneath them, like a flock of birds heading to foreign lands. Back at the prince's castle, When the others slept at night, she would go out onto the wide marble staircase, and the cold sea water cooled her burning feet as she stood in it. She would then think of those down in the depths. One night, her sisters came arm in arm, swimming over the water and singing so mournfully. She waved at them, and they recognized her, telling her how much sorrow she had caused them all. From that night on, they visited her regularly, and one night she even saw the old grandmother, who had not been over the sea for many years, and the Sea King with his crown on his head. They reached out their hands towards her but dared not venture as close to the shore as her sisters. Day by day, the prince grew more fond of her. He cared for her as one would cherish a good, dear child. However, the idea of making her his queen never crossed his mind, and she had to become his wife, otherwise, she would not gain an immortal soul and would turn to sea foam on the morning of his wedding. Do you not love me the most among them all? The little mermaid's eyes seemed to say when he took her in his arms and kissed her beautiful forehead. Yes, you are dearest to me, said the prince, for you have the kindest heart of them all. You are most devoted to me, and you resemble a young girl I once saw but will likely never find again. I was on a ship that wrecked, and the waves brought me ashore near a sacred temple where several young girls served. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her only twice, she was the only one I could love in this world. But you resemble her so much that her image is nearly replaced by you in my soul. She belongs to the sacred temple, and that is why my good fortune has sent me to you. We shall never part. Oh, he does not know that I saved his life, thought the little mermaid. I carried him over the sea to the forest where the temple stands. I sat among the foam and watched to see if any humans would come. I saw the beautiful girl he loves more than me. The mermaid sighed deeply, though she couldn't shed tears. The girl belongs to the sacred temple, as he said. They will never meet again, but I am with him, seeing him every day. I will care for him, love him, and sacrifice my life for him. However, the prince is to be married and take the neighboring king's beautiful daughter as his bride, according to the news. That's why he's preparing such a magnificent ship. They say the prince is going to visit the neighboring king's lands, but the truth is he's going to see the neighboring king's daughter. He'll have a grand entourage, but the little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's thoughts much better than anyone else. I must go, he had told her. I must see the beautiful princess. My parents demand it, but they won't force me to bring her back here as my bride. I cannot love her. She does not resemble the beautiful girl in the temple, like you do. If I were to choose a bride someday, it would be you, my mute foundling with the speaking eyes. And he kissed her red lips, played with her long hair, and laid his head on her heart, dreaming of human happiness and an immortal soul. You're not afraid of the sea, my mute child, he said to her when they stood on the magnificent ship that would take him to the neighboring king's lands. He told her about storms and calm seas, about strange fish in the depths, and what divers had seen there. She smiled at his stories, for she knew more about the bottom of the sea than anyone else. In the moonlit night, while everyone slept except for the helmsman at the wheel, she sat by the ship's railing, gazing down through the clear water. She thought she could see her father's castle, and high up there stood her old grandmother with a silver crown on her head, peering up through the rushing currents toward the ship's keel. Her sisters emerged from the water, gazing sorrowfully at her and waving their white hands. She waved back, smiled, and wanted to tell them that everything was going well and she was happy, but a ship's boy approached her, and her sisters dove back into the water. He assumed that the white foam he had seen was just sea foam. The next morning, the ship sailed into the harbor of the neighboring king's magnificent city. All church bells rang, and trumpets were blown from the high towers, while soldiers stood with waving banners and gleaming bayonets. Every day brought new festivities, with balls and banquets one after the other. However, the princess had not yet arrived. They said she was being raised in a sacred temple far away, where she was learning all the royal virtues. Finally, the princess arrived. The Little Mermaid eagerly anticipated seeing her beauty, and she had to admit she had never seen a more lovely figure. The skin was so fine and translucent, and behind the long dark eyelashes, a pair of steadfast, deep blue eyes sparkled. "It is you," said the prince, "you who saved me when I lay like a corpse on the shore." And he embraced his blushing bride. "Oh, I am too happy," he said to the Little Mermaid. "The best, what I never dared to hope for, has come true for me. You will rejoice in my happiness because you love me the most among them all." The Little Mermaid kissed his hand, and she felt as if her heart were breaking. His wedding morning would bring her death and turn her into sea foam. All church bells rang, heralds rode through the streets announcing the betrothal. Fragrant oil burned in precious silver lamps on all altars. Priests swung censers, and the bride and groom exchanged vows with the bishop's blessing. The Little Mermaid stood dressed in silk and gold, holding the bride's train, but her ears didn't hear the festive music, and her eyes didn't see the holy ceremony. She thought of her impending death, of everything she had lost in this world. Later that evening, the bride and groom boarded the ship. Cannons fired, flags fluttered, and a magnificent tent of gold and purple, with the most delightful cushions, had been set up midship for the bridal couple to sleep in during the calm, cool night. The sails filled with wind, and the ship glided smoothly and peacefully over the clear sea. As darkness fell, colorful lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The Little Mermaid couldn't help but think of the first time she surfaced from the sea and witnessed the same splendor and joy. She joined the dance, twirling like a swallow pursued in flight, and everyone applauded her with admiration. She had never danced so splendidly before, even though the sharp knives cut into her delicate feet. She didn't feel the pain as much as the ache in her heart. She knew it was the last evening she would see him, the one for whom she had forsaken her family and home, given her beautiful voice, and suffered endless torment daily, all without him being aware. It was the last night she would breathe the same air as him, see the deep sea and the starry blue sky. An eternal night without thought or dream awaited her, a night without a soul that she could never attain. Amidst all the joy and merriment on the ship, well into the night, she laughed and danced with the thought of death in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, and she played with his dark hair as they walked arm in arm to rest in the splendid tent. The ship fell silent, only the helmsman stood at the wheel. The Little Mermaid rested her white arms on the railing and gazed toward the east, waiting for the first light of dawn. She knew that the first sunbeam would end her life. Then she saw her sisters emerging from the sea, just as pale as she was, their long, beautiful hair no longer waved in the wind, it had been cut off. "We went to the sea witch and begged her for help, so you wouldn't die tonight. She gave us a knife, see how sharp it is? Before the sun rises, you must stab it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood splatters on your feet, they will merge back into a fish tail, and you will become a mermaid again. You can then return to the water and live with us for 300 years before turning into dead, salty sea foam. Hurry! Either he or you must die before the sun rises. Our old grandmother is grieving, her white hair has fallen out, just as ours did for the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hurry, do you see the red streak in the sky? In a few minutes, the sun will rise, and you must die. And with that, they emitted a strange, deep sigh and sank into the waves. The little mermaid pulled the purple curtain away from the tent and saw the beautiful bride sleeping with her head on the prince's chest. She bent down, kissed him on his lovely forehead, looked at the brightening sky with the growing dawn, and gazed at the sharp knife. She fixed her eyes on the prince again, who in his dreams mentioned his bride by name. She was the only one in his thoughts, and the knife trembled in the mermaid's hand, but then she threw it far into the waves, which gleamed red where it fell, as if drops of blood were rising from the water. With a half-broken gaze at the prince, she flung herself from the ship into the sea, feeling her body dissolve into foam. As the sun rose from the sea, its rays fell so gently and warmly on the lifeless sea foam, and the little mermaid didn't feel the approach of death. She saw the clear sun and 100 ethereal, beautiful creatures floating above her. Through them, she could see the ship's white sails and the red clouds in the sky. Their voices were melodic but so ethereal that no human ear could hear them, just as no earthly eye could see them. Wingless, they floated through the air with their own lightness. The little mermaid noticed that her body was becoming more like theirs, rising above the foam. "To whom do I come?" she asked, her voice sounding as ethereal as the other beings, a sound no earthly music could reproduce. "To the daughters of the air," they replied. "The mermaid has no immortal soul, she can only obtain one if she wins the love of a human. Her eternal existence depends on a foreign power. The daughters of the air don't have immortal souls either, but they can create one through good deeds. We fly to the warm countries where the sultry plague kills humans, and there we provide cooling. We spread the scent of flowers through the air and bring comfort and healing. After striving to do good for 300 years, we receive an immortal soul and share in the eternal happiness of humans. You, poor little mermaid, have strived with all your heart for the same thing as us, you have suffered and endured, risen to the world of the air spirits, now you can create an immortal soul for yourself through good deeds in 300 years. And the little mermaid lifted her clear arms toward the Son of God and for the first time felt tears. On the ship, there was noise and life again. She saw the prince and his beautiful bride searching for her, looking mournfully at the bubbling foam as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Invisible, she kissed the bride's forehead, smiled at the prince, and ascended with the other children of the air to the rosy clouds sailing in the sky. In 300 years, we will float into God's kingdom like this. Even before, we could go there, whispered one. Invisible, we would float into people's houses where there are children, and for each day we find a good child who brings joy to their parents and deserves their love, God shortens our trial period. The child doesn't know when we fly through the room, and if we smile with happiness over them, then a year is taken from the 300. But if we see a naughty and wicked child, then we must shed tears of sorrow, and each tear adds a day to our trial period.